Hello everybody and welcome to episode 8 of Everyday Eternal. I'm joined by Sean O'Brien, Matt Pavlik, and Jacob Corey. Today our subject is control. We've got three main things we want to address. Basically, what is a control deck? What makes a deck a control deck? If I want to play control, how do I want to build? What are the different types of control decks? And we're going to have some examples, not just current, but a little bit of historical. We'll get Old Man Sean in on that. And then the fundamentals of playing control, which is things like how you're going to want to play when you play control, because obviously playing control is going to be a lot different than playing a deck like a combo deck or a deck that wants to play creatures and bash in. No, we want to play the long game and make sure our opponent just doesn't get to play spells or doesn't get to have creatures on board. And that's the kind of thing that, as I said in our first episode, I just absolutely love. So, what is a control deck? Who wants to take this one?
Okay, so let me take a stab at it. I'm probably going to not hit the nail on the head, but I'll take a shot. What is control? If we boil it down to, let's say, like a one-sentence, idea, a control deck is really trying to limit the meaningful options that the opponent has to interact in the game. Does that in a number of potential strategies. One of them that's historical is permission, for instance, just countering any of the spells. Sean, I know you've got some ideas on what control deck could be. Or Matt.
Sure. So, what I think a control deck is usually refers to a deck that is kind of slower. It's not trying to win in the first couple of turns. It's trying to build itself up to have a strong position kind of in the mid to late game, and it doesn't get its value from kind of like playing a small creature and kind of running with it. It's about getting your value off of like big X for ones. So, having, say, like a moat, or Supreme Verdict, or Terminus, or Pernicious Deed, or whatever. Anything where you're getting your X for ones as your big finishes, and then having the game end kind of in the long game with some sort of, like, say, Jace the Mind Sculptor, or even, say, like, Decree of Justice back in the day, or whatever.
Yeah, I think control is typically associated with blue. I think we automatically associate it with blue. But, control can be a little bit of each. It could be control on the stack. It could be control of resources. So it's not always blue, and the history of Magic decks shows it a variety of control decks, from traditional blue-white to mono-black to... I would even argue that there are some colorless control decks, and those are, more like prison strategies, but they're not controlling the stack. They're just controlling each player's resources. But I think the common theme is definitely defense first. The deck isn't flooded with win conditions, and it's usually about getting some card advantage, and different decks do that in different ways. So.
I think we've do you think we've addressed what a control deck is enough that we can kind of move on to what some examples are, because those kind of fit together?
Yeah, I think we'll need some examples to really set the tone for that conversation. So let's jump in.
So we just said that control doesn't have to be blue, but I say fuck that. Blue is awesome. So some examples of control decks in general, a lot of them, especially in recent history, have been blue. Your blue-white Miracles deck, and before Esper got so grindy and playing creatures, like, why would you want to do that? Blue-white Stoneforge was a really great example of what a control deck really wants to be. In general, a lot of them their only win conditions were 4 Stoneforge Mystics, fetching up 1 or 2 equipment, one of which was Batterskull. The rest of it was Force of Wills. It was Brainstorms to draw more Force of Wills. It was Spell Pierce. It was Spell Snare. This is an example of, as we said, control on the stack. For the most part, what you're trying to do is stop them from having anything, from even getting it onto the board. Once it was on the board, you generally play something like 4 Swords of Plowshares, a couple of what we would call Wrath effects because of Wrath of God, the classic example, now Supreme Verdict becoming a little more in vogue. And that's how you would keep things off the board and basically wait until you're ready to win. A lot of players would go for these Stoneforge decks, and they would think of it almost as a combo deck. They would say, I'm going to try and get a Stoneforge on turn 2, get my Batterskull out turn 3. And it's not that anything is wrong with having a Batterskull on turn 3. Obviously, a 4/4 lifelink vigilance is pretty good. But really what you're trying to do is exhaust their resources and say, okay, now that you're done attempting to play Magic, I'm going to go ahead and win. Matt, do you want to give us another example of a control deck?
Yeah, so another control deck would be like, say, Bug Landstill or Bug Control, which basically tries to use Pernicious Deed as its board control element. So you still have the standard kind of Force of Will, Spell Pierce, Counterspell. Sometimes it's even running like Dimir Charm. But you're also running Jace as your main win condition and Manlands. But you run Pernicious Deed as your sweeper. So you basically try to counter what you can't really control or what won't be killed by Pernicious Deed, and then you just run the other deck over with Deed on, say, like 5, wiping their entire board, and then you just get them, while using the Standstill engine as your card advantage engine. So instead of being so stack-based, you're more board-based.
I like card advantage. I mean, I love drawing cards. So, how is that being incorporated into a control deck, for instance, Sean?
Well, control decks started, in the mid 90s when, right after the schism, based mostly on the principle of card advantage. So back then you had, you had the obvious ones like Ancestral Recall, Brain Geyser, Mind Twist. Actually the first World Championship deck was a Mind Twist deck, which was at its heart a card advantage deck. I use a Mind Twist. I Mind Twist you for 3 or 4. I only used 1 card. You're down 4 cards. Therefore, I have more options. So, a lot of the initial... Also, the second World Championship deck was a control deck. More of a traditional blue-white deck. Sarah Angels, a whole pile of counter spells, mana drains, etc. And then cards that got you card advantage, not necessarily through drawing, but the card would lock out a number of an opponent's options or cards so that it gave you, and you can throw a spear and kill me because I'm going to use an internet buzzword, but virtual card advantage. So a card like Moat, for example, it's 1 card, but if there are 2 Tarmogoyfs and a Nimble Mongoose stuck behind it, you, in some sense, have negated 3 of your opponent's cards by using just 1 of your cards. So the old school blue-white control decks kind of worked on that principle. All their cards, they got maximum usage out of. Most of their cards were at least 1-for-1s, sometimes 2-for-1s or more in the case of Mode or Mind Twist. And as Matt said earlier, they weren't looking to win in the early game. They were looking to build resources and eventually just create an inevitability where they could safely play one of their win conditions. And some of them are embarrassing by today's standards, but things like through the years you had Sarah Angel, Fireball, Mirror Universe, Morphling, Rainbow of Free, all the way up through Keeper and some of the other kind of 2000 era control decks, to like something like Entreat the Angels or Jace that we see today. The board state when they actually go to cast their win condition is sort of under control at that point. So it's not always card advantage is central, but it's not always obvious that a card is giving you card advantage. Rest in Peace, another great example. You cast Rest in Peace. Every Tarmogoyf your opponent draws while that Rest in Peace is in play is Bone Flute. You've gained kind of virtual card advantage. So, and I still think blue-white is the best example, of control. But if you were to slam underneath control, you'd have the stack control. I think you'd have Prison is another control strategy, and then sort of a fringe one that hasn't really been good in a number of years would be hand control, hand disruption, discard. You're controlling your opponent's resources before they even get a chance to cast the spells. And discard decks aren't good anymore for a number of reasons, but I still would consider that to be sort of like a control deck.
Yeah, one of my more favorite examples of a control strategy, or just kind of exemplifying that, is the use of Icy Manipulator to manage your opponent's board state, and also along with Maze of Ith too. Both those cards really play into a creature control strategy, which has really played a big part throughout Magic's history. Essentially using the Icy Manipulator to tap down an opponent's creature, and if the opponent wants to be able to continue attacking, they need to deploy a second or a third threat and walk right into, for instance, a Wrath of God. And that way you'd be able to employ a recurring source of card advantage in order to gain an advantage over your opponent.
So one of the cards we want to talk about is kind of the new face of Control. It's hard to find a deck that can play this card and is playing Control and isn't playing this card. And that's Jace the Mind Sculptor. Obviously, among the best cards ever printed. Not many cards have ever been banned in Standard, but Jace the Mind Sculptor has, because he's awesome. He's also the face of From the Vault 20, which is supposed to be a historical product trying to show you what the face of the game was like for the entire 20 years of its history, since I was a wee lad. And so obviously, very good. And 4 abilities, first time ever on a Planeswalker. You've basically, I would almost say 3.5. The first one is its plus ability, which is its half ability. And it's nice to be able to control the top of someone's deck, but that's not really as relevant as the rest of it. Its second ability, which is the Brainstorm ability, obviously super good. You're talking about card advantage. You get to decide what you're going to get next. Played with fetchlands like you would in Legacy or Vintage, you get to get rid of all of the super crappy cards you have. That's the reason it was so good in Standard, is there were so many shuffle effects with Stoneforge Mystic and with Squadron Hawk. The third ability, Bouncing a Guy, Protection. It's commonly been said that the best Planeswalkers always have 1, a way to protect themselves, and 2, a way to win the game. See Elspeth Knight Errant as an excellent example. So, protecting itself, getting rid of a big fatty. Termagoyf is a common target. Unfortunately, Emrakul the Aeon's Torn is not, but Griselbrand is. And then the last ability, which basically says you win the game. I would read the whole text, but what it says is you win the game. So I say 3.5 abilities, because the first 2 abilities that are Brainstorm and Bouncing a Guy, and then 3.5, you get to look at the top of their deck and eventually just win the game. You see this in Bug, you see it in Blue-White, you used to see it in Stoneforge. They're kind of moving away from it as they move towards more mid-range, but man, it does everything that a control card really wants to do. It slowly wins the game, it grinds out card advantage, and it puts their dudes back where they belong, which is in someone else's hand.
Yeah, Jace is awesome. I don't think I can top that. I think a lot of times too with Jace, you're able to because you have the flexibility of using any of the 3 abilities. You really have a lot of options, and that's what really Control wants to see. And it wants to be able to play an adaptable and flexible game, and best react to the opponent's cards. So, for instance, let's say you already have all the answers you need in your hand, and your opponent has an empty board. Well, go ahead, take that opportunity and Fate Seal your opponent. Make sure to lock them out from any potential new additional threats. Or, for instance, let's say you're a little behind on cards, or your hand is pretty weak. Brainstorm ability is able to pull you right back into the game. Hopefully you'll be able to find a couple of big bomb spells, maybe even a Wrath, who knows. And even the bounce ability sometimes you can play a little bit of a tempo element, and just forcing your opponent to recast all his creatures every turn for, maybe not every turn, but 2 or 3 turns is enough to slow your opponent's development back, and allows you to also get back into the game. So Jace is really good at doing all 3 of those parts at pretty much every turn.
Another really important thing that the Bouncing a Dude ability does is you're bouncing a dude, they're almost certainly going to be recasting it. Well, you're playing blue. I frequently find myself waiting to bounce a guy until I have a counterspell in hand, because what I'm doing is I'm taking 2 turns to say, you are going to spend all of that mana, and then that guy's going to go to your graveyard. The other thing I found myself doing a lot recently is I've been playing the Energy Field Miracles build. And because you're more or less safe behind that wall, just sitting there drawing cards and drawing cards and drawing cards, and at a certain point, there's nothing anyone can do to you, because you've got 7 cards in hand, you're playing counter spells, you've probably got several lands in play, and I don't even need to tick him up to slowly win. I'm just going to eventually draw what I need while not letting you play Magic, which, as I've said, is exactly how I prefer to play Magic.
So also, too, talking about some of the other Planeswalkers, it seems like most of the control decks have switched to Planeswalker win conditions, whether that be, Jace, or Sorin, or Elspeth, or even Garruk as something that they could, build up to. Liliana as well, depending on the colors that you're in. And kind of moved away from that one big kind of bomb spell or that one creature So, for example, Sarah Angel used to be really, really good in the old kind of vintage keeper decks, as a 2 of. Great card. However, a little bit fragile, dies to a piece of removal, dies to whatever. So, back in, I guess it would be like 2006, 2007, the blue-white control decks used to be running Decree of Justice. So Decree of Justice, basically, you would either, cycle and make a whole ton of, 1/1s, or you would actually cast it and make a whole ton of 4/4s. So that's also pretty good. However, it leaves you open to the deck holding up a counterspell or multiple counterspells against your, one of two win conditions. So moving to planeswalkers to have something that's more of a long-term threat as well as a win condition, something that they have to deal with, put your opponent on the defensive, is something that the control decks have moved to, and I think it's definitely a much better direction. Sean, if you want to continue.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it on the head. That it's not necessarily that the deck needs to be blue, but any of those decks can use those planeswalkers to play the control role in a game. So, um, but I think the overriding theme is still the same. If you land a planeswalker like Sorin or Garruk, good Garruk, you're going to get card advantage out of it, right? If you're making wolves or vampires, um, it's going to need to take a card from your opponent to remove it. So it's the same thing applies.
What about, for instance, the non-permission based control decks? So I think Sean mentioned mud or stacks types of decks that
Pox.
Pox is another great example of decks that play non-traditional control but are able to essentially control maybe a board state or what kind of options you have.
Yeah, a card like Chalice of the Void. If you play a Chalice of the Void and pass the turn in most Legacy Opens or Star Cities, you may have in fact blanked, 16 cards in your opponent's deck. So you've not only controlled their strategy, you're controlling the stack with a permanent in this case. You're also getting, card advantage out of that Chalice of the Void because there are going to be a number of dead cards that are stranded in their hand. That kind of deck also wants to control resources, typically, through the most obvious one, Wasteland, but there were times, and it's still a decent card, but things like Smokestack, Tangle Wire, Winter Orb, any of those cards can help control the board, control resources. And your deck, much like the old blue-white decks, is built to take advantage of the environment that you're creating by playing these lock pieces.
So one of the things I would like to point out here is that these separations we've given for different types of decks, obviously none of these are hard and fast. You're not always this type of deck or always this other type of deck. And I think these taxing effects, at least right now, are very much where you see these combinations. So for example, with the taxing effects, you kind of see that a little bit in Maverick, which is kind of control, kind of aggro. You see it a little bit in Death and Taxes, which is a little bit control and a little bit aggro. And you see it with decks that are going to be playing a lot of discard spells. Decks like Bug, also decks like Deathblade that are playing Thoughtseize, Inquisition, Duress. So you're playing a little bit of control with a little bit of other stuff. In the past, some of these have been a little bit better, like Stax has won a couple of opens in a couple of years ago. Really, really good in Vintage, where you're going to go turn one, I play a Lodestone Golem. What are you going to do about it? Obviously, all of these are kind of like this. For example, Blue-White, we said, is a control deck. Some people take it a little more aggro-y. I just wanted to take the moment to point out that all of these things kind of blend into different sections of Magic.
Yeah, and kind of on the back of that, too, you see a lot of examples of not necessarily a complete control strategy, but elements of it. For instance, Tempo Threshold shows a lot of that. It plays a lot of counterspells, so it has a very big counter wall, but at the same time it wins with a few aggro creatures. Another example of it may be like the Bug Shardless decks, which tend to play more of a control deck with very few counterspells, but more hand disruption and just deploying a lot of cards and a lot of card advantage with the Cascade and Ancestral Visions. finally, you have a deck like Pox, which is really just cutting you off from any resources. This is more of a strategy that's kind of been antiquated in modern design, but it's still very, very potent if you're able to deploy the correct sequencing. So, for instance, against a lot of decks that deploy one-mana creatures like Deathrite Shaman, Noble Hierarch, Delver, getting that Smallpox out on turn 2 sets them back 3 cards if you count the discarded one as well. Essentially resetting them back to turn 1. Control player.
Yeah, so I think when you're playing the control deck, you have to put yourself in the control role, which is recognizing that in a lot of these builds, you have limited win conditions, and so you have to kind of value those more highly than you would a Curd Ape in a zoo deck, let's say. So it's important, I think, for the control player to put himself in a mindset of trying to look at each of the cards in his hand, and I hate to use another internet term, but really put a lot of value on it. You don't necessarily need to look at your Swords to Plowshares, look at the first creature your opponent slams and automatically exile it. You need to understand that you have, other ways to get, examples. I guess in today's game, you'd have Supreme Verdict, Engineered Explosives. You have Terminus. So, you need to understand as the control player that you don't necessarily need to react to everything that your opponent does. So I think that's really important, and that's a much different mindset than something like an aggro player would take. So a Goblins player or a Rogue Delver player, they're looking to deploy a threat and force their opponent to react to it. So I think the control player's mindset is a lot different, and I think it holds true for the 3 flavors of control. Stack control, resource control, and even hand disruption. Hand disruption maybe is the one that's again a little bit of an outlier, and can be a little bit more aggressive. But I think that's the basic mindset.
And I think a little part of it, at least for the people who are a little more, I'm gonna call myself amateurish, is I wanna do something crazy. I wanna be a Timmy, and I wanna do some stupid combo like Entreat the Angels, or spending 5 turns on Jace, or Helm Leylining you. And so I want to play control because I'm going to say, no, you're not going to play Magic. I'm going to spend the next 10 turns assembling this dumb combo, and then I'm going to go off. And as an example of that, when I first got back into Magic, because like many people, I quit and came back like 10 years later when I had money to actually buy cards, my first deck was a 5-color stacks deck. And part of the reason I liked playing 5-color stacks is it was kind of, no, I don't want you to interrupt me. I'm just going to slowly get out a fatty that I'm going to beat you with, and you're not going to have any basic lands in play because it's a Sundering Titan. Now I'm playing blue-white control because I'm kind of, no, I don't want you to play anything. I'm going to do one of my ridiculous combos. Like when I played Counterthopters for quite a long time, and it was just kind of my MO. I'm just going to get like 1,000 Thopters, and what are you going to do about it? And even if you do something about it, I just have this one other backup condition, and what are you going to do about that one? And I hate to come across as the douchebag who doesn't want their opponent to play Magic, but that's exactly what I think of every single combo player. So fuck those guys.
Wow, that was strong. I mean, it sounds like... Yeah,
it sounds like I had 7 or 8 ounces of Macallan before I started on this beer.
Yeah, or a bunch of Tez players beat you up in middle school and stole your fucking lunch money.
So how do I play control? What's my mindset going into a matchup? It's been a while since I picked up a control deck. Not gonna lie here. Grizzlebrand's a hell of a card, but when I did touch up on it, roughly about 12 months ago, I was mostly playing Miracles. Not Miracles. That was too early. Too late. Thopters. Generally it's the same idea. A lot of times you're just deploying your threats very hesitantly. For instance, like Humility or Moat. Really just trying to get the maximum value off your opponent's blunders, really. A lot of times too, utilizing your life as a resource. So just like Sam mentioned, not really answering the first threat, but possibly the second or third one. especially with the advent of Jace in control decks, you're able to kind of tempt your opponent to overextend into a Wrath. And I mean, that's really a classic example of an aggro deck against control, is you don't walk into mass removal needlessly. Another aspect that I've also kind of learned from that is to really identify which spells your opponents are casting are really going to impact you, your board, or your plan of victory.
So I think my mindset for playing control is asking the question, basically anytime anything happens, is does it matter? So I play a land and I fetch a basic and I do nothing and I say pass, and my opponent plays a Nimble Mongoose, and I look at the cards in my hand and I have to ask myself, does this card matter? Does this matter? I have 19 life left. I've got several turns. It's still a 1/1. Do I care? No, don't worry about it. Basically, I want to get myself up to a point where I can, say if I'm playing Miracles against Maverick or something, where I'm like, okay, let's set up the Terminus. All I'm worried about is, have you played a Gaddock Teeg? Is that a Gaddock Teeg that's going to be coming down? Yes? Kill it or counter it. If not, I'm getting my Terminus ready. And eventually, at some point, when my opponent is disheveled and sad and ready to give up, that's when I play Jace the Mind Sculptor and say, okay, let's Fate Seal you. Or,
Okay, you're ready to concede now.
let's Entreat the Angels for 6 at end of turn and then untap with them.
Oh, that's aggressive.
And, that's...
I've seen Entreat the Angels being cast for 2 to start turning the game around. I mean, 2/4/4 Angels is pretty fucking solid clock.
Best case scenario, I'm saying.
Right.
So the point is, I think asking yourself as the control player, you have to basically see, whatever my opponent's doing, does it matter? If it doesn't matter, don't worry about it, don't fret over it, deal with it later on, or try to get a few more targets in your X for ones, or whatever you plan to be doing, or whatever you're doing to control the game. Whatever your actual game plan is, stick to the game plan.
So as an example of that, I think a really interesting thing I've had lately, like I said, playing Blue-White Miracles, is I'm playing 3 Rest in Peace and 3 Enlightened Tutor. The only creature that Rug plays that I care about is Delver, because I'm going to get a Rest in Peace that's going to make their Termaglyph and their Nimble Mongoose very, very sad.
So moving on to our next topic is actually how to play a control deck. So if I'm playing, say, Blue-White Miracles, because this seems to be the most conspicuous control deck in the format right now. I mean, you're not seeing a ton of, say, Bug Land still doing really well. You're not seeing Bug Control or Esper Control, that's not, say, Esper Blade or whatever, doing really well. So we're going to talk about, say, Blue-White Red Miracles or Blue-White Black Miracles, and kind of how do you play against the format. So one of the advantages that at least this control deck has in the format is it has between 6 and 8 basics, which is an insane amount. And you might be thinking, well, what am I do? Why are you playing so many basics? Well, the format is full of Stifle, Wasteland, this, that, whatever. It doesn't matter. Just a ton of non-basic hate. So if you can have a stable mana base going from, turn 1, I play a basic. Turn 2, I fetch for a basic. Turn 3, I have another basic. Turn 4, oh look, it's another basic. I'm hitting my land drops every turn, which is one of the key things about playing a control deck. Your land drops matter. In a mid-range deck or an aggro deck, you might miss your turn 3 land drop and you'll be okay. However, in the control deck, you want to have mana every turn. It does not matter. And always fetch basics if possible. Know when to fetch as well. These are little things that I think a lot of people have forgotten because control hasn't really been a very viable archetype in Legacy in the past maybe 3 to 5 years. It's kind of been, waning quite a bit. So I think one of the key things as, say, a Miracles player that you should know is,
how to use
fetch
Brainstorm?
How do you brainstorm is an entire episode.
Yeah, I think that one's for sure. I mean, you could brainstorm differently based on the archetype. So, in a control mindset, for instance, Matt, how would you brainstorm?
Well, you don't want to use your brainstorm as in the like say turn 1 I played an island, end of turn brainstorm. That might be strictly incorrect. It might be correct depending on what your hand is, but usually you want to save your brainstorms for, am I looking for an answer to blow out my opponent? Am I looking for a terminus? Am I trying to put something back? Am I trying to see new cards? What am I trying to do with that brainstorm? Am I just brainstorming for value? That's probably not what you want to do. You don't want to be wasting your key brainstorms just on that. You're not a rug delver who has ponders and brainstorms where you could say just, oh, I'm looking for more gas, scoop up some more cards, and let's just go. Sean?
Yeah, kind of on that note, you see a lot of rug players who are novice just continue to play lands out, and they don't necessarily need to. They don't realize they shouldn't be doing that, but um, the blue-white control player wants to make a land drop pretty much every turn for the first, probably 6 to 7 turns, right? So, sometimes having to use like a phase brainstorm to ensure that you hit a land drop is worth it too.
And this is one point that makes Control a lot different than most Legacy decks, is that you want a kind of land-heavy hand, because, as Sean said, you want to hit land drops every turn for about 6 turns. A 2-land hand, unless it's got a lot of free counterspells, probably isn't that great.
So, also, too, because you're playing a deck that has basic lands and you're trying to make these land drops, the question is, when are you actually fetching? So, in a deck that plays, say, 9 fetch lands and 6 basics and some duels and whatever, if you're playing in a format like you are now, with rug tempo, say blue-white-red tempo, doesn't matter. They may be playing Stifle. So the question is, I've seen a lot of control players just play into the dazes, into the spell pierces, into the stifles. What you need to realize is you need to sit back and you just need to very slowly build up your mana base. Turn 1, play a land and pass. Turn 2, play a land and pass. Turn 3, it may be wise just to play another land and pass. When are you fetching? So if you were to fetch just during your turn for value, I'm going to fetch a basic and go get another, say, island or your second plains or whatever your hand is. It doesn't matter. Is there a point in doing that on your turn? What if they stifle you? Well, does that do anything?
I kind of want to add to that, for instance, too. Now, you bring up a very interesting and good point about when to crack your fetches. That is, when are you actually being pushed to utilize your mana? And I think some of the best openings that I've ever experienced with Control Deck have been essentially playing my first spell on turn 4. Maybe that's kind of jumping the gun, because if the first spell you're casting is on turn 4, you've probably won as a Control Deck already. But anyways, being able to essentially make those land drops, like you said, Matt, and really identifying when you need to start fetching, that's a huge point. I mean, first of all, you're masking what colors you may be potentially playing. Granted, it's going to be some strong blue variant, but are you running red, for instance, or black, or green, or white? Being able to sit behind those fetch lands also limits the information your opponent has to work with.
So, I mean, you can also... So, speaking of fetching, when you're pressed for your mana, when are you doing this? So I think one of the key things that a lot of people don't realize is the tempo decks are trying to out-tempo you. Therefore, why would you let them stifle on their turn on your turn when they have mana open and it doesn't cost them anything? Having that mana used on your turn doesn't do anything for them. They just get to untap, they get to draw, and they get to do whatever they're doing. If you say crack on their upkeep, at least if they're going to stifle you, you've used up a mana on that turn. Maybe they won't be able to deploy Tarmogoyf that turn. Or if you have like 4 fetches out, they won't have 4 stifles. And if they do, well, their hand is probably garbage because they don't have anything else. But the point is, you have to create positions when you're the control player when it's very disadvantageous for your opponent to, say, try and get you, or daze you, or spell pierce you. If you're playing your first, say, Sensei's Divining Top in turn 3, they need to have a spell pierce and a daze to be countering that, or a force of will pitching a card. You're avoiding all of that tempo flavor that they're trying to get out of you just by just waiting and biding your time.
And we discussed this a little bit last week when we said that the fetch in response to a fetch is an example of a really great way to play around that stifle. Because if you fetch while they have a fetch open, that fetch is going to get an island that's going to get a stifle. And even if it doesn't, you should just assume it does, because Rug Delver lives to just make your life terrible.
One of the earliest control decks was called the Deck, and it used to have a play called the Sarah Gambit, where, like in game 2, you would side out a lot of your creature control, and what they would do is just play one of their few threats out really fast, figuring that you had taken out all your creature removal. So it's kind of like they would take an aggro roll. One of the cards that blue-white has access to that can kind of let them be a little bit more aggro is Vendilion Click. And Vendilion Click's gotten a lot better now with the new Legend rule. But it's a card that a control deck can use to confuse its opponent, to take advantage of a Vile activation, to take advantage of a tutor, let's say. And it's a super versatile card that lets a control deck play an aggro role. You know what I mean? Sam, I know you masturbate to a poster of Vendilion Click on your wall. Can you talk a little bit more about it?
Well, I can neither confirm nor deny these allegations, Senator, as I have no recollection. I will say, I actually have pulled the Vendilion Clicks out of my Miracles deck, but I used to play 3. Vendilion Click, for me, in the control deck, did 2 major things. A lot of times it got one of their, not necessarily combo pieces, but I'm making air quotes like Dr. Evil combo pieces. Like, they would Stoneforge Mystic, get a Batterskull, I'd say, okay, that's fine, and then I would go ahead and just take that Batterskull away from them.
You wouldn't, for instance, try to wait till they activate Stoneforge Mystic to get the most amount of value?
Well, sometimes I'm just not as good a player as you are, Koby.
Recall that Vendilion Click has Flash, so if you want to get your opponent's Jace, oh yeah, get in there, attack for 3.
Yeah, a lot of times I use it almost as a combination Jataxian Probe / shitty Duress. Because, especially like against combo decks, it's like, oh, I recognize that this is the turn you're going to go off. I'm going to risk that the card you draw will be good, but guarantee that I take your good card. For example, I say, oh, you have an Ancient Tomb and an Island. I'm going to go ahead and cast my Vendilion Click, because that means that you're probably going to try and play something ridiculous with your show and tell.
I think one important point about control that we haven't mentioned or have not really made good mention of is that control inherently is going to be a harder archetype to play it's a hard deck to play just in terms of the number of decisions that you're making throughout a course of a turn, but it's also a hard deck to build. You really have to understand what kind of decks you'll be facing, which in turn will determine what kind of cards you want to include. For instance, if you know you're going into a very aggro metagame, you want to be including a lot of creature removal or ways to nullify combat. Cards like Engineered Explosives, Moat, Humility, Wrath of God, Supreme Verdict, Terminus, Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile. Another example might be if you're going into a really combo heavy, you may want to include more permission, like Flusterstorm, Spell Pierce, Forceful Will, Counterbalance, even basic old Counterspell, and I've even seen some lists run Mana Leak. Matt, what are some other examples?
So, I mean, you're trying to build the kind of quote-unquote perfect 75 to any kind of tournament. I don't think one can just play the general 75 cards and do well with, a given kind of control archetype. So, I mean, at least for Miracles, like, you want to make sure you have, like, enough creature removal. You want to maybe have something for artifacts and enchantments. You want to have maybe a Pithing Needle or an Aethersworn Canonist or whatever. You want to be able to... Not a Torchbearer, Sam, no. You want to have... maybe you want to run the Enlightened Tutor package over Spell Pierces, or maybe you want Vince or Shaper Savant, or... You basically... I feel like if you're playing a control deck, you need to know your list very, very well, know your outs, play to them. I know that probably goes for any other deck. However, more so for for the control decks, because you need to know your list, you need to know your time limits as well. Can I win this game? Can I pull this out? And sometimes I've seen a lot of people who are playing Miracles are like, oh yeah, I have this out somewhere here. There's a 1 of in the deck. I'll still keep playing when it's quite obvious that you've just been overrun and you need to quit. Because you need to save enough time. A lot of Legacy tournaments are running, 45 to 50-minute rounds. It's not a lot of time for the slower control decks.
Yeah, that's something a lot of people I play with have actually commented on, is that I check the clock constantly because, especially playing a Miracles deck, there are some times when you just say, you know what, I would rather concede and attempt to win 2 games in a row than take this game out for the next 20 or 30 minutes. As a really good example of how Control is a really difficult deck to build, Miracles plays the countertop combination. The countertop combination means that every single card in your deck, you have to say, not only, what does this do, you have to say, what does this flip and counter? So, for example, when I play against Omnitel with a countertop build, I'm siding in my Blood Moons, even though that doesn't get any of their cards, because it flips to counter their Show and Tell. Also, as Matt is pointing out to me now, knowing the top 3 cards of your deck, super important. I can say, as someone who has a reasonably good memory and who has played countertop a fair amount, watching someone top because they forgot that the card on top of their deck counters the spell is one of the most frustrating things I have ever watched. And I have actually, in a casual game after a tournament, just kind of like smacked someone and said, hey man, there's already a 1 on top. Why are you spending a mana?
They should just concede. I mean, that's basically just like saying, I suck so bad at this deck, called counterbalance, that, like, I can't even use the fucking card the deck is named after. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, you're allowed to take notes, and most players will. When they see someone's hand, they will take notes. A lot of players you'll see who don't have a great memory, they'll take notes on everything. So, for example, if somebody Caraxes back their Venser, they'll write down, okay, he's got a Venser in hand, keep that in mind. You need to do, if you can't remember what the top 3 cards of your deck are, maybe kind of fold your notebook over a little so your opponent can't see it and just write them down. It's not going to hurt you anything
Dude, if you
to have
can't
it written
remember
down and
3
guarantee you
fucking
know.
numbers, you should not be playing Magic. You should be fucking changing my oil at the fucking dealership. I mean, you're stone fucking retarded, or you're on, Quaaludes if you can't remember 3 numbers.
Not just knowing what they cost, you really do need to know what they are, because occasionally you need to tap draw with top and grab the card off the top without paying the mana. For example, if you have 1 planes open and the only way to counter Show and Tell is to tap draw and Enlighten Tutor.
Getting back on topic, another point with counterbalance and top, but mostly specifically with top, is understanding what you're looking for when you activate it. Spending close to 30 seconds trying to figure out how the 3 pieces that you look at play into your game plan is really abusing the clock, and really that should be called a slow play. So I've seen players activate and resolve top as quickly as 5 seconds. I've seen players maybe take a little bit more time. I think anything more than 20 seconds is really pushing the clock, though.
I think that's one of those things that kind of depends on context. Like, occasionally I'll be like, activate top, and I'll just flip the top 2 cards because I know what they are. There are some times when you need to, like, really sit and tank about it, but it kind of depends on the situation, and I think any judge who's going to be called on it is going to say, okay, yeah, this is one of those times when you really do need to think about it.
For demonstration purposes, we're going to wait 20 seconds to show you how long of a time this actually is.
I'm bored, holy fuck.
Yeah, like, I can't...
It's not even been 10 seconds
Stay
yet.
quiet for 20 seconds. Yeah, I'd have to call a judge on something.
Yeah, it's really got to be an intuition feel. If something feels like slow play, generally it's going to be slow play. Just the mechanics of it should take you only about 1 to 2 seconds. Picking up the cards, taking a look at them, setting them back, kind of keeping a watchful eye, remembering what you put back on top. I'd give it about 20 seconds tops for top.
To be honest, I think 20 seconds is actually way more than generous. I mean, if it's 3 new cards, maybe. I mean, but usually, like, if you've played the deck enough, you're kind of like, okay, well, I have a 1, a land, and a 3. Okay, well, do I want to draw any of these? Well, the 0 is probably useless. Put it on top. What's the next most common thing in their deck? 1 or 3. Probably put the 1 on top. Cool, I've reordered. I've talked about it, and that took 10 seconds. So you could probably do it in like 5 to 7. Knowing your opponent's deck list is also pretty damn important.
That certainly helps out. So I think like we covered a pretty good fundamentals of how to play against control, for instance. How to play control. How do we play against control? How are strategies to beat it or take advantage, for instance, of the slower clock?
Well, one thing the control deck often needs is access to their hand. So, any early game hand disruption. Again, they want to make the most out of every card in their hand. They want to make sure they get usage out of everything. So, a deck that can disrupt their hand early and follow it up with a threat um, is always a good strategy against control decks. There are also specific cards that Wizards has designed over the years to alleviate the frustration that people feel from getting their shit countered. So, specific cards designed to hose, well, islands in general, and also cards designed to just allow you to resolve your spells. I think the most prominent now is Cavern of Souls, but Aether Vial, and then things to attack islands like Choke, attack them on the stack like with City of Solitude or Defense Grid. All those things can frustrate a control player. An active Aether Vial might blank a great deal of the permission spells in their hand. So that's one way to attack them. And the other way to attack them is sometimes just to overwhelm them. And I think that's where a lot of the aggro control decks come into play. The most classic one is probably Merfolk. I mean, they can reach a critical mass of 16 power by the fourth or fifth turn, all of which island walk. They only need to pressure you into terminusing a turn earlier than you'd like to, and just daze you right out of the game. So,
Yeah, Merfolk is actually exactly what I had in mind when we talk about how we want to beat control. Because, as you said, Aether Vial, Cavern of Souls, you're playing a lot of stuff that's uncounterable. Overwhelming them is awesome. If you have one, you only need 2 cards in hand, Force of Will and a blue card, to say, oh, you know what? That board wipe doesn't matter. And even if they do board wipe, like, what's the worst that can happen? If they board wipe, you spend 2 or 3 turns getting more Merfolk out while all they've been doing is topping and getting a few more cards into their hand. Another thing we talked about on the combo episode is if you're playing against a countertop style deck, a really good play sometimes is just playing things in weird orders, like playing a 1, then a 2, then a 3, then a 1, then a 2, then a 3, just so that they have to reorganize their stuff every single turn. So you want to play a 1, and they say, okay, let me put a 1 on top, it's countered. And you say, okay, now I'll play a 2. And they say, okay, I'll play another mana and go ahead and get my 2 and put it on top. And you say, oh, now that you're tapped out, I'll go ahead and play my 3 that I actually care about.
And I think also one element that I've definitely utilized to great effect against the modern Miracles decks from Maverick, Gadok Teague. It seems like a lot of control cards cost 4 or more or have X in them. So Jace, Supreme Verdict, Moat, Engineered Explosives, Elspeth, Terminus, Entreat the Angels. Teague does a lot of powerful work against the modern control decks, and being able to protect the Teague is a really strong play against that archetype.
he's a cornerstone of Cavern of Advisors.
Uh-huh. So, my take on it, like how to actually... Yes, I know. Naming Advisor for your Engineered Plagues could be relevant. So, what you want to do... Another card that is very, very good against at least the Miracle Control deck, Thalia, Gadok Teague, and some sort of protection. So, like, the Mother of Runes Gadok Teague draw is pretty darn good. I mean, stopping, like Jacob was saying, or Sylvan Safekeeper, stopping all of their, Terminuses, Supreme Verdicts, etc. are really good. Even if you just have Thalia, making their Brainstorms cost more, costing 2, you have their counterspells are costing 3, even delaying Supreme Verdict to turn 5, very good. You're able to put more pressure on board, get them to a lower life before they're able to say Terminus or whatever they need to do. Even Mind Sensor, again, because you're fiddling with their lands. It's a lot of fetch lands to go fetch those basic lands. Since you can't touch the basic lands, you might as well touch their actual fetching ability. So if they're not actually finding any lands, So I mean, any hate bears or getting rid of their card advantage engine. So I mean, if you're able to say turn one pithing needle sensitive divining top, that's a huge kick in the nuts to any sort of miracles player. I mean, not being able to reorder anything or go dig for their miracles. I mean, that's the point of that deck. So I mean, if you're really attacking that fundamental brick in that wall, the whole wall just comes down.
One card that I think that we touched upon as a key element for control decks is actually quite good against control decks as well. Planeswalkers. If you're able to slap down, let's say, Garruk or Elspeth, or sometimes even Liliana, and able to essentially grind out the activations in to maximum effect, and essentially just make the control player expend a lot of resources trying to deal with that Planeswalker, you're able to gain a little bit of leverage. One thing that we forgot to mention with Planeswalkers is that they provide an effect after they've resolved over turns. And so you're able to utilize your mana on both sides, both from the control player as well as against the control player, over the turns for that free effect.
Sorry, I mean Sam and I are basically building Cavern of Advisors in the background here. Um, so we've got all right. This would be a segue. Cavern of Advisors. I'm serious. There's a ravenous rat that is also a human advisor. He's a corrupt court official. He's pretty insane, right? Black one, and then you also have an actual advisor who can two any dude when he comes into play. So like he's actually a eunuch also, which is pretty sweet. You know what eunuchs actually are? Everyone know?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So anyway, can you imagine Cavern naming advisor casting a corrupt eunuch and killing your opponent's Deathrite Shaman with it?
It's all about playing with, those really techy, edgy cards to get your opponent. I mean,
But not Tech
that's
Edge.
no. God no.
And
So
ready,
I think
this is the last I'm going to say on Cavern Advisors, but keep in mind Imperial Recruiter is also an advisor. So like any advisor that you happen to need that minute, you can get it with Recruiter.
You could even add Aetherval to really stick it to control.
Yeah, yeah. Masako the Humorless also an advisor.
Anyway, moving on. I think that kind of hopefully wraps up our discussion about, control decks, what they are, how to play them, how to beat them.
Yeah, I
Sam,
think we
you wanna-
can.
Young Phoenix also an advisor.
God damn it,
So-
Sean.
So let's move on
I think
to...
we've wrapped up this advisor discussion already.
So let's talk about what we played last week. Any interesting plays? Anything we might be playing this week? What's going on? Events? Jacob?
Sure, I'll bite. So over last weekend, I got to play Sneak Show again, combo. Taking a little inspiration from our last podcast. And it just so happens to be that I found myself in top 8 against a bracket that was completely filled with miracles. So in the quarterfinals of the top 8, I got to play against miracles. And on the other side of that semi-bracket was miracles against miracles. So here I am sitting next to 3 miracle players, scratching my head thinking, man, I really hope they don't play 2 Caracas, because that is a bitch of a card for show and tell.
Really?
Really, yeah. I bested one of them, but then I lost to the ever master of miracles, Joe Lossett.
Well, you should have been playing World Spine Worm plus Sneak Attack and just got him.
Yeah, that was the deck I played a couple weeks back to a 2-2 record. So wanted to at least redeem myself with some extra prizes. Walked away with a tropical island, so pretty happy about that.
Yeah, so for me, last week we had a qualifier for the Vancouver Summer Legacy Classic, and we didn't get too many people to show up, but I was playing Bug Control, so basically Bug Landstill without the standstills, because everybody was playing Tempo, so I'm like, well, standstill, not so good when they have a Delver down, right? So anyway, I ended up placing 4th and winning back a Snapcaster Mage, wasn't too bad. I've been playing Miracles a few weeks before that, blue, white, red Miracles, and it's been performing really well. I think I just need to tune up the sideboard a little bit. Should be good. I think Miracles is really well positioned right now. I know we've said this for ages, but yeah, I think it's really well positioned. What about Sean?
Well, I got to play Vintage Sunday night, so that was fun. We're starting a league that we're going to run kind of 4-week seasons. We're going to give away a playmat, and play for some cash, beer money every week, but then also have it build up into a playmat that's going to be given out every season. So I took Wizards and sort of Esper Wizards vintage, and I've left my time walking home. So I subbed to Hercule's Recall in the last minute, but I had a good time. I ended up going 2-2. I lost to the other deck I brought, which was Caged Fury, which is like a hyper aggro zoo deck with a bunch of hate cards in it. And then I also lost to Dredge in a match where I believe I resolved all 3 of my Yiggsla jailers, and he had already exiled Dark Blast, and I still lost. So that shows you the power of vintage Dredge.
So I've been, as Matt was saying, I was also playing Miracles. I've made some kind of maybe odd changes recently. I took out the one of Caracas because I just figured my odds of drawing one Caracas fast enough for it to matter in the show and tell matchup just weren't strong enough to keep it. The other kind of maybe weird change I made was I did something that I did when I played Counterthopters, which is that I brought in a Seat of the Synod because an Enlightened Tutor for a land sometimes is worth it. I kept a hand that was 3 lands, one of them a Tundra, Enlightened Tutor, Jace, and other junk. And I ended up winning the game on the back of Enlightened Tutor for Seat of the Synod, tap out, play Jace, and just slowly but surely win. My funniest story, though, of last week was I played a guy playing a Reanimator deck that had no way to deal with enchantments. And when I played a turn 2 Resident Piece, he said, "Let me read that." And he read it, and he said, "Oh, that's really good against me." But he did play out the rest of the game, which did not go his way. Next week, I'll be playing probably about the same thing. Like Matt said, I'm also tweaking my sideboard. Right now, I'm kind of weirded out by my sideboard. I'm playing a mountain in the sideboard because I'm playing 2 Red Blasts and a second Blood Moon, but I only have 1 Volcanic main. Still trying to figure out what the rest of the cards need to be for my particular meta and for the national meta for when I go to an upcoming Star City and in a couple months after that, or a couple months from now, GPDC, which might be the first ever Everyday Eternal meetup, maybe?
We'll see.
-1.
-2.
Yeah, it's a far ways off to burn vacation days.
So I was playing Reanimator testing against I think it was a Miracle deck. Can't remember what he was playing, but he was playing Aethersworn Canonist and like Rest in Peace and stuff like that. So I'm testing. I'm being bad guy playing Reanimator, and I'm playing a very techy Buried Alive Dark Ritual Reanimator deck with some Show and Tells main, Show and Tells on the side. Anyway, it's been testing pretty well. So I managed to Show and Tell a Terrastodon into play, and my opponent didn't really have anything that I wanted to blow up except a Rest in Peace. So I blew up the Rest in Peace, and then he plays another Rest in Peace, and he's got Canonist, and I'm really like, ugh, what is going on? So I managed to draw into a Chain of Vapor. I Chain of Vapor his Canonist at end of turn, and then he Chain of Vapors by sacking a land, getting my Terrastodon, and then I proceed to triple Dark Ritual, triple Show and Tell, Terrastodon, what was it? Sphinx of the Steel Wind, and something else. I think it was frickin' Gristlebrand or something like that. And then I just proceeded to crush him. It was great. I blew up my own lands off the Terrastodon and just went aggro. It was great.
Sphinx of the Steel Wind. He's my fucking favorite Reanimator target. I know he's been completely obsoleted, but that guy is a fucking baller.
No, he's still so good, though. Like, I mean, against some of the decks, sure, some decks just don't care. But sometimes the life matters, right? And I have one in Russian, so I might as well play it.
I mean, it's smaller than a Gristlebrand, and it doesn't draw you cards, so I failed to see the argument there.
But
one
you can't
interesting
always
thing,
draw cards anyway. Sometimes I like having the first strike lifelink.
So funny story about that. Don't pay 7 life to go down to 1 life to try to counterspell a Jace. That won't end up well. In another good story, I recently on Saturday night I was playing local Legacy, and I got an opportunity to reanimate with the actual reanimate cards. So losing 8 life, a Gristlebrand into play. I'm playing Tin Fins for funsies, and I draw cards naturally because my opponent's playing a mono red deck. So throw caution to the wind and just be reckless. The first card I draw off that is Children of Corliss and a fetch land. So naturally I go back up to 20 and start going into turbo mode. Out of that, though, the new legendary rule actually came up very beneficial for me because I was able to ritual entomb the second Grizzlebrand, shallow grave it, and then bin the one that had just reanimated. So where in the past it would have killed both of them, under the new rules I'm now able to bring into play with haste and attack. So kind of some new tricks to get familiar with and hopefully blow some people out.
And that's all we have for you today. As always, thank you for listening. You can give us your feedback by emailing everydayeternalcast@gmail.com. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/everydayeternalpodcast. And follow us on Twitter @eternalmtg.
Flash! Protector of the stack!
I got 2 birds in paradise. They're gonna tap it and make my mana nice. I got 2